Oscar de la Hoya was once seen as the perfect embodiment of the American dream in boxing, a true golden boy who went from the cramped gyms of East Los Angeles to the very pinnacle of world sports with a string of achievements that few fighters in history have ever touched. He won the gold medal at the 1992 Olympics for the United States, bringing national pride at a time when American boxing desperately needed a new icon. In the professional ring, Oscar became a world champion in 6 different weight classes, a feat reserved for only the greatest fighters of all time. The biggest names in boxing from his generation all stood across from Oscar de la Hoya at some point. And every fight was more than just a sporting event. It was a national celebration where millions of American viewers watched every punch. He filled massive arenas, generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, and became a familiar face on television, in advertisements, and on magazine covers. To the public, Oscar was pure victory: handsome, talented, disciplined, successful early and successful big, a fighter who carried Latin power while being celebrated by America as a national icon, a man who achieved everything an athlete could possibly dream of in a single career. But behind that dazzling record was another story, darker and heavier, where every championship belt represented not just glory, but also parts of a human being traded away. When the lights went out and the cheers faded, Oscar had to face a broken-down body, lingering aches that never truly went away, a mind worn down by the constant pressure to always win, and the fear of being forgotten. The punches that put him in the history books also left deep scars on his spirit, pushing him toward depression, isolation, and silent battles with himself. There were nights he couldn't sleep, not because he lost, but because winning had taken too much. Yet it was in that darkness that Oscar de la Hoya's true willpower showed most clearly, the willpower of a man who refused to be crushed by the pain that fame brought, of a person brave enough to admit his weakness, to confront invisible wounds, and to keep living when there was no longer a ring to hide behind. At 52, he's no longer the unbeatable golden boy in the eyes of the crowd, but he remains a man who stands tall after everything, carrying his scars as proof of the price of glory, and the strength not to let tragedy define his entire being. If you want to keep following the journey behind the spotlight of Oscar de la Hoya, where glory and tragedy intertwine to the point of suffocation, please hit subscribe so you don't miss the next part of this story. Thank you for staying until the very end, and join us as we step into the next chapter, where the truth behind the Golden Boy begins to be revealed. East Los Angeles was never a place for dreaming. It was where people learned to survive before they even figured out who they were. Hot, dusty streets, cramped houses, car horns mixed with shouting, violence lurking in daily life like an inseparable part of existence. And for a child born into a Mexican immigrant family like Oscar de la Hoya, childhood was never a time to choose or delay. It was a relentless push forward driven by poverty, expectations, and a wordless sense of destiny. In that place, boxing wasn't a romantic dream, much less a path to freedom. It was the only escape life offered to kids with few other choices, a rough, painful escape, but clearer than any other door. While other children learned to name their fear, Oscar learned to hide it. While other children were allowed to be weak, Oscar was taught that weakness was a luxury, something that simply didn't exist in a world of honor and win or lose. His Mexican family carried values that were both sacred and crushing. Honor was everything, losing was shame, and emotions were to be swallowed, because no one had the time or space to listen to a child say he was scared. In that small house, silence wasn't peace, it was discipline, the way adults protected themselves from a world already harsh enough. And it was that very silence that taught Oscar every pain had to be endured alone. Boxing entered the boy's life not as an invitation, but as inevitability, as if the gloves had been waiting for him to grab them, not because he loved it, but because there was no other road left to take. Every training session was a lesson in taking punishment, not just with the body but with the spirit, learning to get up when it hurt, learning not to cry when hit, learning to see injury as normal, as the price to pay just to survive. Oscar learned to take punches before he learned to say, "I'm scared," because in that world fear wasn't acknowledged. It was either turned into strength or buried deeper. The boy grew up faster than his years, not because he was wiser, but because he had no other choice but to adapt, and every punch he took carried a silent message. If you want to get out of here, you have to win, not once, but every time. East Los Angeles didn't allow fragile dreams, it only accepted those tough enough to endure, and Oscar learned that early, learned that his worth was measured by his ability to stand after impact, by refusing to fall even when blood and sweat mixed on the gym floor. In the family, love wasn't spoken, it was shown through sacrifice, through pressure, through the belief that if the child was strong enough, he wouldn't be crushed by life like so many others. But that very way of loving placed a weight on Oscar's shoulders that he never asked for, the weight of expectation, of having to become the family's pride, of having to lift everyone out of poverty, of having to win to prove that the silence, the harshness, and the punches all meant something. Oscar's childhood had no room for asking, "What do I want?" because the only question life asked was, "Can you take it?" And with every passing day, the boy answered that question by walking back into the gym, clenching his fists tighter, and learning to turn fear into something he could control. The greatest tragedy of that childhood wasn't in the specific punches, it was in the fact that Oscar was never allowed to choose another path, never allowed to stop and ask whether he even wanted to fight, because from the very beginning, life had already decided for him: if you want to survive, you have to learn to bleed in silence. Oscar de la Hoya faced the biggest moment of his life, not in the ring, but in a hospital room, where the smell of antiseptic drowned every fragile hope, where the most important woman in his life was slowly being drained day by cancer, and for the first time since learning to clench his fists, Oscar realized there were battles where strength meant nothing. His mother's illness came like a slow sentence, quiet, undramatic, but suffocatingly cruel. Every visit to the hospital felt like time was racing faster than he could keep up, as if the clock had betrayed him, counting down every second while he was still too young to grasp what permanent loss really meant. Oscar fought everything he could fight. He fought time by training more furiously, fought money by jumping into bigger fights, and fought his own helplessness by convincing himself that if he won enough, earned enough honor, enough money, enough pride, then a miracle would happen. But cancer didn't care about honor, didn't wait for silent promises, it advanced coldly, step by step, while Oscar stood watching, fists clenched, unable to punch anything. There were evenings he sat beside his mother's hospital bed, listening to her breathing grow weaker, and in those rare moments, the boy from East Los Angeles was no longer a fighter, no longer the family's hope. He was just a terrified son, paralyzed by the fear that everything he was doing out there might not be enough to keep her here. When his mother passed away, Oscar's world didn't collapse in a loud explosion. It cracked quietly, leaving a void nothing could ever fill, and in that void, a deep guilt took root and stayed for the rest of his life. He wondered what he had done wrong, whether he had trained enough, won enough, come home early enough, and though no one ever said it, Oscar carried the feeling that if he had been stronger, faster, more successful, maybe things would have been different. It was the kind of guilt without a clear shape, impossible to remove with reason, existing only as a persistent whisper on long nights, reminding him of a promise he couldn't keep. When the 1992 Olympics arrived, the whole country cheered, the media praised him, and Oscar stood on the highest podium with the gold medal shining on his chest. But that moment didn't bring complete victory, because in his heart, joy was smothered by an unchangeable truth. The person he most wanted to share this triumph with was gone. For Oscar, the Olympics was no longer the peak of his dream. It became a farewell ritual, a promise sent to his departed mother that he would keep going, that he wouldn't let all those sacrifices become meaningless. But that very promise turned into a burden, because every victory afterward carried a painful question. Would Mom be proud? Does she see me? Is continuing to fight really what she wanted? From that moment on, boxing was no longer just an escape or family honor, it became an emotional duty, Oscar's way of trying to fix what couldn't be fixed, trying to atone for a loss no one was to blame for. He carried his mother's image with him into the ring, along with the emptiness and the fear that if he ever stopped, he would have to face head-on the pain that had never healed. The Olympics should have been the start of joy, but for Oscar, it marked the beginning of a journey where every win was shadowed by grief, where the gold medal shone less brightly than the memory of a mother who had left, and where the central tragedy of his life took shape, a man who spent his entire life fighting, not to defeat opponents, but to run from the feeling that he had arrived too late to save the most important person. The 1992 Olympics should have been a moment of liberation, the finish line for years of brutal training, and the well-deserved reward for a kid who grew up in poverty. But for Oscar, that gold medal felt more like a door slamming shut than one swinging open, because the moment that cold metal touched his chest, his fate was sealed in a way that could never be reversed. American media didn't wait for Oscar to grow up or heal from the loss of his mother. They needed an icon right away, a story beautiful enough to tell the entire nation, and they built the Golden Boy, with the ruthless speed of stage lights, placing a young man who hadn't even begun to understand his own pain onto the pedestal of expectation. That image spread across the United States, the radiant smile, the chiseled body, the shining gold medal, a perfect American dream wrapped up in one specific person, and from that moment on, Oscar no longer belonged to himself. Success came too early, and took away the most precious thing youth can possess: time to make mistakes, space to be weak, and the right to slow down when his soul hadn't caught up with his body. No one asked Oscar if he was ready, because that question didn't exist in a world where a champion is created quickly to serve the needs of the crowd and the industry. Every handshake, every contract, every time he stepped in front of a camera, pulled him one step further from the boy from East Los Angeles, turning him into a carefully designed image, a profitable asset, a brand that had to be protected at all costs. While his peers were still fumbling to find their identity, Oscar was locked into a role that allowed no deviation, because any slip could bring down the entire story that a whole system was exploiting. He lost his youth not because time flew by, but because he wasn't allowed to live it like a normal person. He lost the right to make mistakes, because every small error was magnified under the microscope of public scrutiny, and he lost the right to be weak, because a golden boy doesn't cry, doesn't get confused, doesn't admit he's not ready. From then on, every step Oscar took was watched, every decision carried the pressure of representing an entire community, an entire nation, as if that burden was the price he had to pay for the gold medal. Success didn't offer him an escape, it locked the door behind him, and pushed him forward at a speed that didn't allow looking back, and in that process, the real Oscar was gradually compressed beneath the glossy shell. He learned to smile when he didn't want to, learned to give the answers people expected, learned to stand tall in front of cameras, even when everything inside was crumbling, because any sign of hesitation was seen as a threat to the icon. The Olympics stopped being a warm memory to return to and became the starting point of an endless chain of obligations, where every next victory wasn't a choice but a mandatory requirement. Oscar began to understand that from that second onward, he was no longer a young man who had just lost his mother and was trying to find meaning in life. He was a national asset that needed to be preserved, exploited, and protected. The transformation happened too fast, too forcefully, leaving him no time to ask whether he even wanted to become the Golden Boy, because once that name was given, it turned into an invisible chain, forcing him to live according to a script that didn't allow stopping. Success coming too early didn't bring freedom, it took away the right to choose, and in the blinding light of the gold medal, Oscar began a long journey, where he had to learn to survive as an icon, while the human part inside him was increasingly forgotten. Oscar de la Hoya's career wasn't measured simply by the number of wins, but by the level of damage his body had to endure over the years, as if every step forward on the record books was paid for with a permanent piece of his health taken away. 6 championship weight classes weren't just glittering numbers on a stat sheet, they were 6 different chapters of the same painful story, where his body was constantly pushed to the limit to meet expectations that never lowered. Each belt came to Oscar not through one magical moment, but through thousands of quiet sparring rounds, tens of thousands of punches absorbed in the gym, collisions that never made it to television, never replayed in glorious highlight reels. The public saw the precise punches thrown, the opponents dropping, the arms raised in victory, but they never saw the nameless punches that numbed shoulders, rattled brains, made spines groan day after day. Every time Oscar stepped into the ring, his body already carried old cracks, and every win only spread those cracks wider, like a wall forced to stand tall even as the foundation weakened bit by bit. The punches that never made the highlights were the ones that truly shaped his career: a hook to the ribs in a meaningless sparring session, a knee collision that left his back throbbing for weeks, small concussions repeated so often that he could no longer tell normal pain from warning signs. Oscar learned to live with pain not as a temporary challenge, but as a constant state, a background noise that never turned off in his body. Nights after every fight, when the arena lights went out and the crowd had left, he faced a completely different reality: pain spreading through his body, muscles locked tight, mind heavy as if submerged in water, and an emptiness hard to name. There were nights Oscar lay motionless, afraid to turn over because every small movement triggered waves of sharp pain, and sleep became a luxury, torn apart by nagging headaches and the echo of punches still ringing in his ears. In those moments, victory didn't bring satisfaction, it only underscored a terrifying truth: every time he won, his body grew a little weaker. The public called it dedication, warrior spirit, but for Oscar, it was a daily process of self-erasure, where the line between strength and destruction blurred into something dangerously thin. 6 championship weight classes meant constantly forcing his body to change: rapid weight gains and cuts, prolonged physiological stress, cycles of physical torture that only those who lived through them could fully understand how brutal they were. Every weight class change was another time his body was forced to adapt at any cost, and that cost was never refunded. Oscar entered each fight as a champion, but left it with another invisible burden, another piece of his health tucked away like an unrecorded debt. The most painful thing wasn't the punches from opponents, it was the feeling that his entire career had been built on a foundation of irreversible wear. The public saw an icon rising, saw belts stacking up, saw history being rewritten, while Oscar only saw himself slowly disappearing beneath the shell of victory. He felt reflexes slowing, felt his body needing more time to recover, felt pain appearing even when he wasn't training, like a reminder that no win was ever free. To fans, each fight was a night of glory, but in Oscar's private life, it was the start of a long series of nights, where pain, emptiness and sleeplessness became familiar companions. The championship belts hanging on the wall couldn't soothe the feeling that the human inside was eroding along with the body, that every victory celebrated out there pulled him one step further from himself. From the outside, Oscar's career was a rare string of successes, but from the inside, it was a cruel measurement, where every milestone was marked by injury, and every step forward left an unanswered question: was the price too high for a dream he was never allowed to choose from the beginning? When winning started to feel suffocating, Oscar de la Hoya understood that the scariest thing was no longer the opponent in front of him, but the silence that followed every time he raised his arms in victory. Each new win didn't erase old fears, it only pushed those fears higher, heavier, because in the world he lived in, winning wasn't a destination, it was the condition for existence. The pressure to keep winning surrounded Oscar like an invisible noose, tightening slowly with every fight, every contract, every cheer from a public that never said enough. He understood the ruthless rule of fame very clearly: just slow down, just hesitate, just take one step back, and the crowd would turn their backs faster than any punch, and the fear of being forgotten became the most toxic but effective motivation. That fear wasn't abstract, it had a concrete shape, carrying memories of East Los Angeles, of streets where poverty didn't allow anyone to stop and rest, where going back meant being swallowed by the past he had fought so hard to escape. Returning to being the poor kid from East LA wasn't just losing money or fame, it was losing the meaning of every sacrifice he had endured, admitting that the punches, the painful nights, the years without youth ultimately weren't enough to shield him from the cycle of destiny. That fear kept Oscar from stopping, because in his mind, stopping was never rest, stopping was losing, being erased, proving to the whole world that the icon they built existed only on momentum, not real strength. He looked around and saw other legends forgotten once they stopped winning, saw how quickly the media changed their tone, and understood that the crowd's loyalty always came with conditions. So every time his body sent a distress signal, every time his mind begged for a breath, Oscar suppressed it all with one single question: if I stop now, Who will be the next one celebrated, and where will I be in that new story? Victory therefore stopped being joy, and became duty, a duty so heavy that every time he fulfilled it, he felt he lost another piece of freedom. In the ring, Oscar still moved, threw punches, controlled the pace like a champion, but inside, he was trapped between two parallel fears, fear of continuing and fear of stopping. Continuing meant further eroding his body and spirit, stopping meant losing everything that had defined him for years. No choice brought peace, only different ways to endure. Every time he signed a contract for the next fight, Oscar felt like he was pushing himself into a vortex he could no longer control, where fame drove faster than recovery, and other people's expectations outweighed his own need to survive. He didn't dare admit to anyone that there were days he didn't want to step into the gym, not because he was lazy, but because he was so exhausted he no longer recognized whose body it was. But a golden boy wasn't allowed to say he wanted to stop, because that image didn't accept hesitation, and Oscar had lived in that image too long to know how to escape without destroying himself. The fear of being forgotten followed him in every silent moment. In every morning he woke up with a heaviness that never went away, reminding him that if he didn't keep himself at the top, no one else would do it for him. Fear of returning to the poor kid from East LA wasn't just material fear, it was a deeper psychological terror, fear that without wins he would have to face head-on the unanswered questions about himself, about his worth, about whether he deserved love when he was no longer the champion. And so Oscar kept stepping into the ring, not out of a hunger for glory, but because he saw no other way out, kept winning to postpone the moment he had to confront himself. Winning in that state was like breathing in an oxygen-starved room. Each breath kept him alive a little longer, but at the same time made him realize the air was running out. When winning began to feel suffocating, that was when Oscar understood he was fighting not just opponents, but the very idea that one day he would have to learn to live without winning to prove he existed, a lesson he was never taught, and never dared to start. There was a time in Oscar de la Hoya's life when the ring was no longer the most dangerous place. Instead, it was the long nights after victory, when the room fell silent and his mind refused to shut off even though his body was completely exhausted. Alcohol began to appear not as a pleasure, but as a temporary switch to blur the noise in his head, the quickest way to quiet thoughts that never stayed still. At first it was just a few drinks to help him sleep easier after the pain, to slow down the replays of fights, the pressure, the unnamed fears. But very quickly, alcohol wasn't strong enough anymore to fill the growing emptiness inside. Stimulants stepped in like a false promise that he could control his emotions, that he could choose when to feel what, that he could be the champion under the lights and a painless human being in the dark. But the harsh truth was that every time he tried to shut his mind off, Oscar woke it up even more violently the next day, and the emptiness didn't disappear, it just changed shape, becoming deeper, colder like a bottomless pit, swallowing everything around it. There were nights Oscar lay staring at the ceiling, counting every breath, wishing he could sink into sleep without dreaming, without remembering, without feeling, and in the darkest moments, the thought of not wanting to wake up the next morning passed through his mind like a terrifying relief. Not because he wanted to die, but because he was so tired of having to keep living stretched tight between the icon image and the real human being, between the world's expectations and his own need for peace. Oscar's depression wasn't loud, it didn't explode into public breakdowns. It crept into every habit, every decision, every moment he was alone, turning joy into a luxury and silence into an enemy. He could stand in front of thousands of people, smile, answer interviews, sign autographs, but when the door closed, all that remained was an exhausted man who no longer recognized why he had to keep trying. The emptiness stretched on so long that Oscar began to believe it was the default state of his life, that maybe this was the unavoidable price of winning too much, of living too long in a role he wasn't allowed to leave. The nights he didn't want to wake up weren't the weakest moments, they were the clearest sign that he had been pushed to the limit, where the willpower that once kept him standing in the ring was now only enough to keep him alive one more day. When Oscar entered rehab, it wasn't a romantic decision to start over or find himself the way media often tells it. It was a pure act of survival, the last choice to keep from sliding deeper into the darkness. Rehab didn't bring miracles, it didn't erase the pain or instantly return peace, but it forced Oscar to stop in a space where he couldn't escape himself with alcohol or drugs anymore. There, for the first time in many years, he had to face head-on the emotions he had avoided for too long: unresolved sadness, fear of being forgotten, anger at himself for not stopping when he needed to. Rehab wasn't where Oscar learned to win again, it was where he learned to admit he had lost the battle with his own mind, and that losing didn't make him worthless, it just made him more human. The days there passed slowly, with no cheers, no lights, only heavy conversations and silent moments that forced him to listen to himself, and in that silence, Oscar began to understand that depression wasn't a sign of weakness, but the consequence of enduring too long without being allowed to stop. He didn't walk out of rehab feeling completely healed, those wounds had been too deep for too many years, but he walked out with a new, fragile but important awareness that continuing to live, continuing to wake up every morning, was sometimes victory enough. The nights he couldn't shut off his mind didn't disappear completely, but they were no longer a place where he was trapped alone, because for the first time, Oscar allowed himself to admit he needed help, that he didn't always have to be strong, and that surviving himself was sometimes harder than any fight in the ring. After the nights he couldn't turn off his mind, Oscar de la Hoya began facing a paradox even more painful than depression. He wasn't just tired of life, he was slowly starting to hate the very image he had created and been forced to carry for so many years. To the public, Oscar was still the flawless icon, the golden boy who rose from poverty to the heights of glory, the face of victory, discipline, and the American success story. But when he looked in the mirror, Oscar only saw an exhausted, hollow man who no longer recognized who he had become in the process of trying to meet those expectations. Every time someone mentioned the name Golden Boy, he felt like they were talking about someone else, a polished, edited version shaped to fit the story society wanted to believe, not the real person struggling every day, not to collapse. The pressure of American masculinity weighed on him like an unspoken law. A man must be strong, must be in control, must stand tall no matter how broken he was inside. He wasn't allowed to be weak, wasn't allowed to cry, wasn't allowed to admit he wasn't okay. Oscar had followed those rules for so long that he forgot they weren't truths, they were just a mold imprisoning his emotions. He learned to smile at the right times, say the right things, appear in public with confidence, while the real human being was forced to stay silent, pushed into the backstage of his own life. The separation grew sharper, to the point that Oscar began living two parallel lives, neither of which truly belonged to him. One life played out under the lights, where he was the champion, the successful businessman, the admired man. The other existed in the shadows, where he was the tired, doubting man always wondering what value he had when he wasn't winning to prove it. Those two lives didn't intersect, they clashed and hurt each other, because the harder he tried to maintain the icon image on the outside, the more estranged he felt from himself on the inside. There were moments he hated stepping out, hated playing the role everyone expected, hated the feeling that the love and respect he received always came with conditions, as long as he stayed strong, stayed successful, stayed without cracks. That hatred didn't turn outward, it turned inward, and aimed at himself, making every small mistake proof of self-blame, every moment of weakness, something that had to be hidden. Oscar began to wonder whether Golden Boy was really a reward or just a mask worn too long to ever take off again. The pressure to maintain masculine perfection didn't just make him lonely, it made him ashamed of his own pain, because in that world, suffering was only acceptable if it led to victory, otherwise it was seen as personal failure. Oscar had learned to endure in silence from childhood, and now that lesson returned like a curse, leaving him unsure how to ask for help without feeling he had lost his worth. The two parallel lives exhausted him, because there was no space to be fully himself, no place to set down the burden of the image and say he was tired. The public kept seeing the icon, kept retelling the story of success and glory, while Oscar withdrew more and more, hating the feeling of being viewed through the lens of a name he no longer recognized. That self-hatred didn't explode into rage, it quietly gnawed away, making him doubt every compliment, distance himself from every cheer, because they seemed to love only the image, never touching the real person. In that division, Oscar began to understand that the tragedy wasn't just the punches or the sleepless nights, it was living too long in a role until he forgot he had the right to be weak, to be afraid, to exist without proving anything. The golden boy the world adored gradually became the mirror reflecting his deepest exhaustion, reminding him that the more beloved an image is, the easier it becomes for the person carrying it to lose themselves, and Oscar de la Hoya paid for that icon with his inner peace, an icon he no longer had the strength to love. Oscar de la Hoya entered love with the same mindset he entered the ring, all in, no defense, always believing that if he tried hard enough, nothing would fall apart. But love isn't like boxing. There are no rounds, no referee, and no clear moment of victory to know you did it right. Throughout his peak years, Oscar was always seen as a man who had everything: fame, money, charisma, family. Yet behind the lights, he was a man who never felt safe in any relationship, even the closest ones. Marriages came and went, not because of a lack of feeling, but because Oscar didn't know how to stay. He brought into love the same unhealed wounds from childhood, the same deep fear of abandonment that had rooted in him since he was a boy in East Los Angeles. Whenever a relationship grew close, whenever the other person wanted to step deeper into his inner world, Oscar panicked. He didn't know how to say he was tired, that he felt empty, that there were days he no longer recognized himself. Instead of opening up, he stayed silent. Instead of facing it, he withdrew, and love, which needs presence, slowly died in that emptiness. When his children were born, Oscar thought he had finally found the safe haven he had searched for his whole life. But fatherhood opened another fear, deeper and more painful, the fear of repeating the cycle of hurt. He loved his children with a fierce, almost frantic love. Every time he looked at them, he saw his younger self, a child who needed to be held, needed to be heard, but didn't know how to ask for it. And that was exactly why Oscar was even more afraid. He feared that his incomplete presence would leave scars just like the ones he had carried his entire life. The harsh reality was that even when Oscar was physically there, he was often absent in spirit. After fights, after long flights, after nights of no sleep because of alcohol and drugs, he came home like a shadow. His children grew up seeing a famous father, but feeling an unnamed distance. Oscar wasn't lacking responsibility, but he lacked the peace to truly be there. And that became his greatest regret. He could take punches for the whole world, but he was powerless to keep his family whole. The broken relationships left Oscar not just with regret, but with a profound sense of failure. In the ring, losing a fight was something he could accept. But in family, every time he walked away felt like proof that he wasn't good enough, wasn't stable enough, wasn't a complete man. That feeling followed him into the night, when the house grew quiet, when titles and money no longer spoke to him. Oscar once admitted that he loved deeply, but never felt safe being loved. For him, love always came with the fear of loss, and because he feared losing, he unconsciously pushed people away before they had the chance to leave him. That was the most painful paradox of his life, craving connection, yet living like someone always preparing for goodbye. In adulthood, looking back, Oscar realized that the heaviest punches of his life didn't come from opponents in the ring, they came from the moments he lacked the courage to stay with the people who loved him. Family was never a safe refuge, not because they didn't want to protect him, but because Oscar never believed he deserved protection. And in that truth, there is a quiet but persistent pain deeper than any physical injury, the pain of a man who loved profoundly but never learned how to stay without fear. After the private breakdowns and the feeling that he never truly had a safe refuge, Oscar de la Hoya turned to power as his final layer of armor, believing that if he could control his career and the flow of his life, he would never be hurt again. Golden Boy Promotions was born, not just as a smart business move, but as a survival reflex, a desperate attempt to reclaim the decision-making power he felt had been taken from him far too early. As the boss, Oscar believed he would no longer be forced to continue when his body and mind were exhausted, that he could protect other fighters from the mistakes he had once made, and most importantly, that he would no longer be an asset in someone else's hands. But power, no matter how strong, could not heal the deep-rooted wounds. Controlling fight schedules, contracts, and money brought a temporary sense of security, but it could not fill the emotional void that always remained. Golden Boy Promotions quickly grew into an empire, with Oscar at the center, making decisions, directing, and shaping the fates of others, but in that very role, he recreated a familiar cycle. The more power he held, the more isolated he became. Conflicts began to emerge, not from a lack of success, but from pressure, from ego, from the piled-up expectations among people all carrying their own ambitions. Whispers of betrayal, of self-interest, of loyalty crept into the backstage, and Oscar, who once believed control was the way to avoid pain, had to face the bitter truth that power only changed the form of the pain, it didn't erase it. Every dispute, every fractured relationship in the company brought back the old feeling. Betrayal didn't come from open enemies, but from those who had once stood very close. Oscar tried to stay strong, tried to be tough, because in the ruthless world of business, softness was seen as a sign of failure, but inside, he grew more and more tired of having to play the role of the one who controlled everything. Golden Boy Promotions gave him status, a voice, and surface-level respect, but it also pulled him further away from the ability to connect genuinely with others, because every relationship now carried the suspicion of whether it came from real affection or from self-interest. Standing at the peak of power, Oscar once again felt utterly alone, just like the feeling after every big win, celebrated on the outside, empty on the inside. He realized that controlling fate didn't mean understanding himself, and becoming the ultimate decision-maker didn't help him escape the emotional cracks that had existed for so long. Power became a defensive wall, hiding the vulnerability behind it, but that wall also kept anyone from getting close enough to truly help him heal. Golden Boy Promotions, with all its success and controversy, reflected Oscar himself in this phase, strong, decisive, but deep inside, a man still trying to protect himself from the fear of being hurt again. And when looking at the empire he had built, Oscar had to face a hard-to-accept truth. No matter how much power and influence he held, he could still feel as lonely as the boy from East Los Angeles, because no position, no title, was powerful enough to replace the healing he had never truly allowed himself to receive. Oscar de la Hoya's body never forgot, even when he tried to replace it with titles, money, and power. The injuries accumulated over the years didn't disappear when he left the ring. They just changed how they existed, quieter, more persistent, like a memory tape replayed every day through pain. There were mornings Oscar woke up feeling his body heavy as stone, back stiff, neck stabbing, head throbbing steadily, and it took him a few minutes to remember where he was or what he was doing, because that exhaustion felt no different from the morning after a fight night. Chronic pain became the foundation of his life, no longer an incident, no longer abnormal. It was the default state, the reminder that every punch he had taken had been carefully recorded by his body. The hooks to the ribs, the head clashes, the falls to the canvas didn't just live in footage or public memory. They lived on in every joint, every nerve, every sudden pain that struck when he bent over, turned his neck, or simply stood up from a chair. His body betrayed the legend in the cruelest way. No lights needed, no audience required. Just one careless moment to remind him that the years of victory had left a non-negotiable price. Oscar began to understand that the body doesn't distinguish between glory and defeat, it only records impact and time in boxing always works against the one who once stood at the top. There were days he felt trapped in a body that no longer obeyed, where movements that were once instinctive became difficult, slow, and painful enough that he had to think about every step. The scariest thing wasn't any specific pain, it was the regularity of it, as if the body were replaying every punch, every round, every decision not to stop when he still could. Oscar realized the ring doesn't forget anyone, and it doesn't forgive those who stay too long. The years of fighting had marked him not just with scars, but with permanent changes in how his body functioned, in interrupted sleep, in prolonged fatigue without clear reason. Sometimes he wondered if he could have done things differently, if he could have stopped earlier, protected himself better, but those questions brought no answers, only a heavy acceptance that the past couldn't be fixed by regret. His body reminded him of every fight even when his mind wanted to forget, reminding him that every time he won, a part of his body lost. And in that betrayal, Oscar was forced to face the truth that the legend only existed in other people's memories, while the consequences lived with him every day. With no ring left to shield him, no cheers to blur the pain, Oscar stood before a new challenge, no less difficult than any fight, learning to live in a body that had been written on too clearly by his own history. The ring doesn't forget anyone, and the body is the most honest storage of every decision ever made in the blinding light of glory. After retirement, what hurt Oscar de la Hoya the most wasn't that he could no longer step into the ring, it was the moment he realized the noise had completely vanished. No more cheers, no more lights, no more moments when tens of thousands of people shouted his name at once as proof that his existence mattered. The silence arrived without drama, without spectacle, but heavy like a void pressing straight down on his chest. In the early days after retirement, Oscar still woke up following the habits of a fighter, his body still remembered the rhythm of training, his mind still waited for a specific goal, but then he realized there was nowhere to go, no one waiting, no fight scheduled to count down. The phone stayed silent in a terrifying way, not because he had lost everything, but because the world had moved on to other stories, to new faces, new cheers. For Oscar, no longer being called out wasn't just losing attention, it was losing the most familiar language he had used to define himself. His whole life, he had been measured by the crowd's reaction, by applause, by instant recognition, and when all those measures disappeared, he had to face a question he had never been prepared to answer: if there's no audience, who am I? The silence after retirement wasn't rest, it was a terrifying emptiness, where every emotion was amplified, because there was nothing left to distract from it. Physical pains were no longer drowned out by fight adrenaline, negative thoughts were no longer chased away by a packed schedule, and Oscar had to be alone with himself longer than ever before. There were days he walked through places that were once packed with fans, once greeted with excitement, now just ordinary, indifferent spaces, as if his glorious past belonged to someone else. The most painful thing wasn't being completely forgotten, it was being remembered in a way that no longer mattered, like a name in history, an old clip replayed occasionally, and then put away. Oscar faced that emptiness without gloves, without strategy, without a clear opponent to focus on. Only the raw truth that the fame that once shielded him from understanding himself had now withdrawn. The silence forced him to listen to thoughts he could once avoid, forced him to feel the accumulated fatigue, the unprocessed sadness, and the fear that if no one was watching anymore, did his life still have value? But in that very terrifying emptiness, Oscar also began to notice something else, fragile but important. For the first time, he was no longer forced to perform, no longer had to win to exist. Silence was both the greatest pain and the clearest mirror, where he had to learn to stay with himself without needing cheers as support. After the cold emptiness of the days without an audience, Oscar de la Hoya entered a phase even harder than his years in the ring, the phase of publicly facing his true self. In a culture where men are taught to be strong, to stay silent, to swallow pain, and keep moving forward, speaking the truth can sometimes be scarier than any opponent. Oscar understood that very well. He had lived almost his entire life behind a perfect mask, the golden boy, who always smiled, always won, always controlled everything. But behind that gold was a man exhausted from pretending to be okay for far too long. When Oscar decided to go public about his depression, admitting the years of struggling with alcohol and drugs, it wasn't a media strategy, it was an act of survival. He didn't speak out to be pitied. He spoke out because if he stayed silent any longer, he knew he might not survive. Those confessions faced harsh judgment. Some called him weak, some said he was destroying his own legendary image, some even saw it as a betrayal of the masculine ideal American society had built around him. But Oscar accepted being misunderstood, because for the first time in his life, he no longer wanted to be an icon for anyone. He just wanted to be a real human being. Speaking his pain didn't make him smaller, it stripped away the armor that had been suffocating him for decades. When Oscar talked about the nights he didn't want to wake up, about the emptiness even at the peak of fame, many other athletes quietly recognized themselves in those words. People who had been celebrated, taught that winning was everything, but never taught how to face inner defeat. Oscar didn't claim to be a perfect example, he claimed to be a warning that success isn't immune to mental damage, that fame can't heal soul cracks, that raw honesty turned him into a rare voice in American sports, where men's silence is often mistaken for strength. Oscar began to be heard, not for what he once won in the ring, but for what he dared to admit after leaving it. Interviews no longer revolved around achievements, they revolved around emotions, fears, regrets, and the process of learning to slow down. Some still criticized, but countless others thanked him for saying what they had never dared to say. For Oscar, this was a different kind of victory. No championship belt, no lights, but more profound than any punch he ever threw. He wasn't completely healed, didn't claim to have overcome everything, but he proved that courage sometimes isn't in continuing to endure, it's in stopping and telling the truth. In a society accustomed to honoring men who never fall, Oscar de la Hoya chose to honor vulnerability, and that made his story transcend the boundaries of sports, becoming a reminder to all of America that true strength sometimes begins with daring to admit you've been hurting. When all the noise had finally died down, when the confessions no longer shocked but became part of the story, Oscar de la Hoya began looking back at his life with a different measure, slower and more painful. He once believed his legacy was built on championship belts, on numbers, on sold-out nights and unmatched revenue records. For years, he lived as if every victory was a brick protecting him from emptiness, from the fear of being forgotten, from the memories of poverty and loss that had followed him since childhood. But standing on the other side of it all, Oscar was forced to admit a cold truth. No belt could save him on the darkest nights, no title could stop depression, no win could replace real presence, real listening, real healing. Championship belts could make the whole world cheer, but they couldn't sit beside him when physical pain rose up, nor could they whisper that he still had worth when the lights went out. That truth didn't arrive as a brilliant moment of enlightenment, it came as a series of small realizations, accumulated through painful mornings, silent nights, and rare honest conversations with himself. Oscar began to understand that the legacy he had chased for so long was actually a burden, because it demanded he keep silent, keep enduring, keep playing the strong role even when everything inside had shattered. And that very silence, he realized, was the most dangerous thing to pass on to the next generation. Young fighters looked at him, at the legend of the Golden Boy, and were taught that success meant sacrificing everything, that pain must be hidden, that admitting hurt was a sign of failure. Oscar began to see clearly that his new responsibility wasn't proving who was tougher than whom, it was breaking that cycle before it crushed more people. Honesty for him was no longer a personal choice, it became a moral duty. When he said that winning hadn't saved him, that fame hadn't healed his mind, he wasn't doing it to deny his career, he was putting it in its rightful place, an important part, but not the whole person. Oscar gradually understood that true legacy isn't what makes others admire you, it's what helps them survive. If his story stopped at medals and belts, it would keep feeding a dangerous myth. But if it included the pain, the breakdowns, and the process of getting back up, it could become a more honest mirror for those walking the same path. Oscar no longer talked about boxing as a glory machine, he talked about it as an environment that needed to be re-examined with humanity. He acknowledged what the sport gave him, but he didn't shy away from what it took. It was in that balance that he found a new definition of legacy, not hiding the price of success, but making it public so others could make more informed choices. His conversations with young athletes now revolved around mental health, around learning to stop, around building a life outside fighting even while still winning. Oscar knew no one could turn back time to save his younger self, but he could help save someone in the future with the truth. And that truth wasn't glamorous, wasn't easy to hear, but it was necessary. Championship belts couldn't save anyone from inner darkness, but honest words could open a door so others didn't have to walk into that darkness alone. When Oscar accepted redefining his legacy this way, he also accepted that he would no longer be remembered only as an unbeatable legend. He would be remembered as a deeply conflicted human being, full of scars, but brave enough not to hide them. And in that acceptance, there was a profound sadness, because it came with the realization that so much pain could have been avoided if the truth had been spoken sooner. But there was also a rare relief, because for the first time, Oscar no longer had to protect an image. He was protecting a lesson. The legacy he began to understand wasn't the number of times his hand was raised, it was the number of people touched by his honesty. Not the wins recorded in the books, but the moment someone dared to say, "I'm not okay," because they heard him say it first. And in a sports world that once worshipped silence as strength, Oscar de la Hoya accepted the cost of speaking truth, because it was the only cost he believed was worth leaving behind for the next generation. At 52, Oscar de la Hoya still stands there, still breathes, still walks into new days, but no one can call it a redeemed story anymore. He is still alive, and that in itself is a quiet victory, but it's the kind of victory that brings no sense of glory, no cheers, no explosive moment to close out all the pain. His body is full of scars, not just on the skin, but in every slow movement, every chronic ache that recalls history without needing words. His mind carries scars too, deeper, harder to see, but more persistent than any physical injury. Oscar no longer runs from them as he once did, but he can't erase them either. He lives with them, learning to recognize that some wounds don't disappear, they just change how they show up in daily life. At this age, he no longer searches for one final win to justify everything, because he understands there's no punch strong enough to defeat the past, no title big enough to fill the voids that formed so early. There is no miracle, no everything is finally okay moment, only continuation, day after day, in a fragile but more honest state. Oscar no longer tries to prove he's unbeatable, because he has accepted that he never was. His courage at 52 doesn't lie in continuing to endure in silence, it lies in looking straight at his own tragedy without covering it up. He looks at the choices that brought him here, at the victories once celebrated, and also at the losses that came with them, losses he once didn't dare name. There are days he still feels tired, still doubts, still wonders if he could have done things differently, but those questions no longer destroy him like before. They become part of a belated self-awareness that arrives only after the full price has been paid. Oscar doesn't stand at the finish line of a perfect inspirational story. He stands at a midpoint, where there's no ring left to step into, and no illusion that life will fix what's broken. And right there he exists as a living reminder that some people aren't born to have a neat, complete ending. He didn't win at life the way America usually tells it. He didn't overcome everything to step into brighter light, didn't turn pain into an easy message. Instead, he carries that pain with him, openly, heavily, unpolished. At 52, Oscar de la Hoya is a man still standing, but standing with clear awareness that he isn't fully healed, and perhaps never will be. His standing no longer relies on muscle or fame, it relies on the ability to accept the reality that some wounds will always be part of who he is. And in that acceptance, there is no romanticizing, just a raw truth. Continuing to live is sometimes the bravest act left. Oscar is no longer the golden boy of his early years, nor the flawless icon the public once worshipped. He is a conflicted, scarred human being, but honest enough not to deny it. Looking back at the road he traveled, he no longer asks how many fights he won, he asks what he lost to get those wins. And the answer isn't gentle, but because it isn't gentle, it has value. Some legends aren't born to win at life. They are born to show us the price of never being allowed to fall. Oscar de la Hoya is one of them, not as an icon of perfection, but as a man who walked the full path of fame, and came back with the truth that the greatest victory is sometimes just being here, looking straight at yourself, and no longer pretending everything is okay. Oscar de la Hoya is not just the story of a boxing champion, he is a painful record of the price America often demands from its icons. Throughout the journey, from the poverty and violence of childhood in East Los Angeles, to the death of his mother from cancer he couldn't save her from, to the Olympic wins and world championship belts, we see a clear paradox. Every time Oscar came closer to glory, he drifted further from himself. Details like the lingering chronic pain after retirement, the depressive nights when he didn't want to wake up, turning to alcohol and drugs, the emptiness when the audience left, these aren't isolated personal tragedies, they reflect a system that celebrates victory while ignoring the human being behind it. Oscar's public admission of depression and addiction, his willingness to face judgment in order to speak what American men are taught to keep hidden, that was his greatest moment of honor, because it was when he broke the cycle of silence that had hurt generations of athletes. Golden Boy promotions, power and money couldn't heal him, only underscoring the central lesson: control and success can't replace mental health care. For the people of the United States, this story is a reminder that the American dream shouldn't be measured only by achievements or titles, but by the ability to live honestly, to know when to stop, and to know how to ask for help. Oscar didn't win at life like a fairy tale, but his courage to look straight at his own tragedy turned him into a deeply human warning. Society is only truly strong when it allows its strongest people to be vulnerable. If Oscar de la Hoya's story has made you reflect on the real price of glory and strength, please hit subscribe to the channel to join us on more honest and emotional journeys ahead. Thank you for listening until the very end, and we'll see you in the next video, where we continue to explore the legends behind the spotlight.